St. Lydwine of Schiedam by George Carl Huysmans, Chapter 9. These travels on which the angel conducted Lydwine did not confine themselves entirely to the magnificent or hideous regions of the other world. Very often, without making her leave this earth, he led her far away to the countries sanctified by the death of Christ, or else to Rome, that she might visit the 7 churches, or even simply to the convents of the Low Country. Like Sister Catherine Emmerich, she followed in Palestine the footsteps of the Redeemer from the crib of Bethlehem to the Mount of Calvary. There was no place in Judea which she did not know. One day, when her confessor, whom she later obtained permission to take with her, manifested some doubts as to the reality of these excursions, Jesus said to Lydwine, "Will you come with me to Golgotha?" "O Savior," she cried, "I am ready to accompany you to that mountain, and to suffer and die there with you." He then took her with him, and when she returned to her bed, which corporeally she had never left, they saw ulcers on her lips, wounds on her arms, the marks of thorns on her foreheads, and of splinters on all of her limbs, which exhaled a very profound perfume of spices. On returning home with her, the angel said, "The Savior wills that you should carry back with you visible and palpable signs, so that your director may be assured of your excursion to the Holy Land has not been imaginary, but real." On another journey, when she was climbing behind her guide in a ravine, she sprained her foot, and when she came to herself, her foot was indeed dislocated, and she suffered with it for a long time. There was, therefore, also a material side to these wanderings of the spirit, and she did indeed perpetrate with her angels into the cloisters where he transported her thither. Once the prior of the monastery of St. Elizabeth, situated near Brielle in the island of Dorn, came to see her, and she gave him a description so exact and so detailed of the cells, the chapel, the chapter house, the refectory, the porter's lodge, and all the rooms in the house, that he was astounded. "But how can you know all this?" he exclaimed when he had recovered from his stupefaction. "You've never been there." "My father," she replied, smiling, "I have been there frequently when I was in ecstasy, and I know all the monks' guardians angels there." This power, which seemed incredible, of duplicating herself, of being simultaneously in 2 different places, had been accorded before and after her to many other saints. Bridget of Ireland, Marie de Ors, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Anthony of Padua, all appeared in tangible bodies in 2 places at once. The Benedictine Elizabeth de Schonen, although she was in a town 16 leagues distant, was present at the consecration of a church in Rome. The presence of St. Martin de Porres was vouched for at the same time at Lima and Manila. St. Pierre Religieux adored the Holy Sacrament in one town, whilst he was praying at the same moment, in sight and hearing of all the world, in another. St. Joseph de Cupertino talked with different people simultaneously at 2 different places. St. Francis Xavier did the same on a ship and on a sloop. Marie de Agreda converted the Indians in Mexico whilst seated in her own convent in Spain. Blessed Passidy was present at both Paris and Siena. Mother Agnes de Jesus visited Mount Olier at Paris without leaving her convent at Langac. Jeanne Bonamy was seen 4 days communicating at Jerusalem, though she had not left her abbey at Bassano. Blessed Angelo di Acri tended a dying person in her own house, and preached at the same moment in a church. St. Alfonso de Liguori consoled the last moments of Pope Clement XIV at Rome, whilst he sojourned in flesh and body at Avinzo. And the gift of ubiquity was also bestowed on a lay brother of the Redemptionists, Gerard Nagella. This gift of the Lord is not confined to past centuries. It exists in full strength in our own days. Catherine Emmerich, who died in 1824, is an example of it, and a stigmatized saint still nearer our own times, for she did not die until 1885, Catherine Puccini, the Sister of the Visitation, was seen in 2 parts of Metz at one and the same time. The case of Lydwine is thus not isolated. Neither is it surprising that miracles of another kind abounded in her life, for her realization with the angels continued, and she lived as much with them as with the people who surrounded her. Evidently, she had a very close companionship with the saints during her journeys in Eden, but she does not seem, as so many other saints did, to have kept up relationships with any particular saint. At least her chroniclers do not tell us of that. Once we hear of her contemplating, more especially in paradise, St. Paul, St. Francis of Assisi, and the four preeminent doctors of the Latin Church, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, and St. Gregory. On another occasion, we surprise her receiving a visit at her own home from these same four doctors, who urged her to warn Jan Walter to persuade one of his penitents at Ordeschi, and have recourse to the bishop, or the grand penitentiary of the diocese, in order to obtain absolution for an unconfessed sin, which he, personally, was unable to remit. But those are, I believe, the only occasions on which they were specially concerned with her. Indeed, without neglecting the auxiliary cult of angels and saints, Lydwine was before all things possessed by the divine spouse, who, when he did not intervene in person, employed by preference angels rather than saints to serve as interpreters to her. This impatience which consumed her to go and rejoin the well-beloved in heaven did not prevent her from being the most attentive of women to the poor of the earth, the most charitable towards the poor and the afflicted. She was reduced to live on alms, and yet she distributed these alms amongst the poor. Condemned never to leave her bed, she charged widow Catherine Simon and other friends to distribute them for her, and recommended them to buy the finest fish, and to cook them with tasty sauces, in order to give pleasure to the suffering members of the Christ. Widow Simon, who chiefly occupied herself with these commissions and distributions, acquitted herself of them with such devotion that, after having prayed Jesus to reward her, Lydwine said to her one day when she returned from the market, "The Lord is very pleased with you, my dearest. Tell me the grace for which you most long, and I will intercede that it may be granted to you." "If you will obtain for me pardon for my sins, and the grace of final perseverance, I would look upon you as the best of sisters and mothers," replied the good woman. "For the rest, I leave it to your charity." "You don't ask for much," said the saint, smiling. "However, I charge myself to present your supplication which cannot be displeasing to God. As to the rest that you will leave to my charity, the Lord will provide. Go then to a church, and pray for me." And this woman who had entered, sad and preoccupied, left joyously, knowing well that the prayers of her friend would be listened to. At other times, Widow Simon and her companion contrived, in the interest of the sick woman herself, not to obey her strictly. Distressed at her condition, they arranged to take toll of the sums she confided to them, and to abstract the fraction necessary to supply her wants. But she perceived these friendly deceits, and complained. "I know," she said, "your good intentions, but I wish it had pleased God that you should be more docile, for these wretched folk whom you have defrauded will one day be kings in heaven, and it is wanting in the respect due to them to make them wait in this manner." In other things she was sagacious and far-sighted. When she had hoarded a little money in winter, she salted down meats and sent them in summer, with her benediction, to the beggars she relieved. At other times she offered eggs, beer, butter, bread, and grilled fish, and, when her means permitted, she added a little milk of almonds or wine for the sick children. This far-sighted charity was rewarded by numerous miracles. One day, when they had taken from a pot a quarter of salted beef and divided it into 30 parts for as many families, the quarter was found intact. "Well," she said, astounded at her intimates, "what are you astonished at? Is it not written in the Gospels, 'Ask and it shall be given you'?" The miracle was known by the whole town, and wealthy people wished from devotion to taste this dish. Another day, Lydwine, who manifested a preference for the honest poor, and those who had seen better days, had come down in the world through reverses of fortune, was puzzled to know how she could help certain families. Her provisions were exhausted, her purse empty, and her protégés literally dying of hunger. So she appealed to the generosity of a good man, who immediately cooked a leg of pork and brought it to her. This man was truly merciful, for he himself was in want, and he condemned himself by giving away this joint to living on bread alone. He was not a little amazed when, returning home, he saw hanging in his kitchen another leg of pork, much larger than the one which he had deprived himself, although it had been impossible for anyone to have entered his home. Upon another occasion, an epileptic beggar, whose seizures were frequent, strayed down into town, was seized with a fit in the open street, and dragged herself, when it had passed off, to Lydwine's dwelling. She was consumed with thirst, and drank all the saint's reserve of water. But her thirst was not quenched. Remembering that there was a little wine at the bottom of a vessel, Lydwine told her of it, and she threw herself upon it. But it was like a drop of liquid on a hot shovel. More and more parched, this woman implored them to discover some kind of drink, but it was quite impossible to satisfy her thirst. Lydwine gave her a piece of money, with which she betook herself joyously to the inn, where she succeeded in extinguishing the fire with draughts of beer. Some time later, the saint, in her fever, also wished to drink. Not remembering that the beggar woman had swallowed her wine, she begged her father to pass the vessel that had contained it, and was immediately filled with exquisite red wine, so well prepared that she did not have to add any water to it. It lasted from the feast of St. Remy till the conception of the Blessed Virgin, that is to say, nearly 2 months. But at that time, Widow Simon, who did not know of this miracle, kindly made her friend the present of a jug of wine, which she had chosen from the best to be brought in the village, and poured it into the pot still half full of the celestial wine, so that the flow of this precious cordial was thus dried up. Some time later, the saint, in her fever, also wished of indispensable food, so she was always on the watch to see that her clients lacked nothing, and she found money to clothe them. A priest was pointed out to her, who was in want of clothes, but unfortunately the necessary cloth was not to be found in Schiedam. Seeing how troubled she was, a woman who was fond of her said, "See, I have kept these 6 yards of black stuff, which I have here to make a dress for my daughter. With a little contriving, it could be made to do for the purpose. Would you like it?" Lydwine accepted the present, appeared to measure the stuff, using her mouth and the arm which she was still able to move, and the piece held in her teeth stretched out so that it was more than enough cloth to cut the clothes for the priest, and the dress for the girl. Charity, as she understood it, should extend to all, anticipate want, be active, and know no reserve. One evening, when her confessor and some of his friends were feasting together, a voice was suddenly heard imploring alms. The priest, without hurrying himself, opened the door and saw nothing. He had hardly got back to the table when he heard the same voice again. He went out again and ran into the street, but it was deserted. As for the third time the voice continued to complain, he slipped out another way and ran round to surprise the person who was disturbing him, but it was useless. The street was empty. Troubled by this episode, and convinced that he was the victim of a joke, he went round after dinner with his guests to consult Lydwine. "O men, too slow to listen to the appeal of the poor," exclaimed she, "it was one of your brothers, the angels, crying to you. He came to prove you and to assure you that whether you forget the Saviour in your merrymakings, I wish to God you had guessed who it was." This extraordinary charity also inflamed her passion for suffering, which increased from year to year. To release her neighbor from his ills, and to take them on herself, seemed to her right and perfectly just, for resolute and pitiless towards herself, she could not see others suffer without relieving them. She accomplished without faltering this mission of substitution, which the Saviour had confided to her, for they tell us that she took the place of the souls in purgatory, to finish their punishment for them, and offered herself for Holland, for her native town, to expiate its misdeeds by her own chastisement. At one time a civil war broke out in Schiedam. As usual, instead of defending the town, the peaceful folk fled and left it in great danger of being pillaged by the conquerors. But one of the exiles, who had, at the beginning of the hostilities, taken refuge in another village, returned and said to his friends, who implored him not to stay, "I know well the dangers I run, but I know also that Lydwine's prayers will protect me and the town." These words were repeated to the saint, who murmured humbly, "I give thanks to God, who inspires in simple souls such confidence in the prayers of his little servant." And she did indeed succeed. God alone knows in exchange for what new torments, in disarming the factions and reconciling the foes. Another time she had again to intervene with the Saviour, to save the town from the destruction which threatened it. An enemy fleet, which had already ravaged the seaboard of other provinces, appeared off Schiedam. Lydwine offered herself as hostage to Jesus, begging him to turn his anger on her, and whilst the inhabitants expected to be destroyed, The fleet, in spite of its efforts, and although the wind was in its favor, retreated instead of advancing, and at once disappeared, repulsed in some manner by the prayers of the saint. She was thus the lightning conductor for her country, but when she had been crucified for all the community, she wished to suffer for each individual in it, as the following story shows. One morning, groaning in the street, she asked an ecclesiastic who was seated by her bed to see who was weeping thus without. "It is one of your friends, who is tormented with frightful toothache," he said on returning. Lydwine sent the priest to fetch her, and in the most natural tone proposed to endure the toothache in her place. "You have enough infirmities," replied the good woman, "without burdening yourself with mine. Pray only to the Lord that he will deliver me from this torture." Lydwine prayed, and her friend was relieved immediately, but she herself suffered so terribly for 24 hours that she could not restrain her cries. This transference of an ill from one person to another, by means of prayers, is accompanied by another phenomena. From the bodily sufferings endured by the saint emanated health and celestial powers of healing. Virtue went out of her, as is said of Christ in the Gospels. Her decay engendered good health for others. Thus one day a woman whose sick child uttered piercing cries came, and placing him on Lydwine's bed, immediately his troubles ceased. She smiled at him and praised, in terms he could not yet grasp, the delights of chastity, and he thought over these words when he was older, understood them, and became a priest in memory of her. In the same manner, a merchant in England, who had never heard of the saint, was afflicted with an incurable disease in his leg, dreamed one night that a voice said to him, "Send someone to Holland, to Schiedam. He will procure some water in which a virgin of the name of Lydwine will have washed her hands. Thou wilt apply it to the trouble, and it will vanish away." He hurried on awakening to send a message to the saint. She gave him the water which had been used at her ablutions, and immediately the leg that had been steeped in it was healed. In all of these miracles, Lydwine only had recourse to prayer, and it was probable that, in giving a little water to the Englishman to carry back to his own country, she had prayed for the recovery of the Persian who used it as a lotion. She was indeed more than a passive agent. That is to say, she did not act by herself, as did many saints, who cured infirmities with the sign of the cross or an imposition of hands. She laid their case before God, praying him to hear her, and only played the part of an intermediary between the suffering and Jesus. One single exception of this rule, which she appears to have laid down for herself, is recorded in her biography, and this was when a woman who was dear to her, Widow Simon perhaps, was attacked by a fistula. Lydwine first begged her to visit the best physicians in the country. They all agreed in declaring that there was no hope of amelioration. Then the saint had recourse to the great physician. She betook herself to prayer, touched the fistula gently with her finger, and it disappeared. Her tireless charity did not confine itself to material acts, to cures, to alms, or even to the substitution of herself to bear the ills of others. She exerted it also in the spiritual domain, and there she once practiced mystical substitution of a kind till then unknown, and I think unparalleled in the annals of later saints. Is not the following fact unique? I content myself with giving it as it occurs in the collected lives of the Bollandists. A man who was a true rascal was assailed by remorse, but did not dare address himself to a priest to reveal his life to him. One day he sought out Lydwine, and, in spite of his resistance, made her a complete and detailed avowal of his crimes, praying her to take them on herself and confess them in his stead. She accepted the substitution of the soul, called a priest to whom she confessed the wickedness of this man, and as if she had herself committed them, and fulfilled the penance he inflicted. Some time after, the ne'er-do-well returned. "Now," he said, "that you have confessed my sins, point out to me what penitence I should practice. I swear I shall execute it." "I myself have undergone your penance," replied Lydwine. "I only ask for your mortification to pass one entire night without stirring on your back." The sinner smiled, thinking the punishment light and easy. In the evening he stretched himself out in the position ordered, and resolved, as he had agreed with the saint, that he would not turn himself either to the right hand or the left. But he could not sleep, and the immobility soon appeared to him insupportable. Then he reflected and thought, I complain, and yet my bed is soft, and I have not, like poor Lydwine, my shoulders resting on the straw, and all sore as well. Moreover, she is innocent, whilst I— remorse, which had so tormented him, wrung him anew. He looked back on his life, bewailed his misdeeds, reproached himself for cowardice, and when the day began to break, ran to confess himself to a priest. And this rogue was in future honest. This impious fellow became pious. Lydwine's task was at other times less disagreeable. Instead of listening to the avowals of debauched scoundrels, she received the confidences of good and simple souls. Thus, an ecclesiastic with admirable candor approached her to be enlightened on the state of his soul, and of those which his ministry obliged him to direct. Lydwine received him pleasantly, but refused to reply to certain questions, which she judged indiscreet. Persuaded that he had displeased her, he went and knelt weeping in the church before the altar of Our Lady. There he fell into a trance, a thing which had never happened to him before, and he saw a young girl advancing towards him, accompanied by 2 angels, who sang the Salve Regina, and filled him with such joy that his soul would have burst if the ecstasy had not then ended. And soon he came to himself. He ran to the house of the saint. Well, she said when he had entered, fine weather has succeeded rain, father. Surprised, he cried, It was you who walked past me, escorted by 2 angels, when I was prostrated in the chapel of the Madonna. She smiled, but was silent. On another occasion, an excellent woman who was tempted by the devil, and after struggling vainly began to despair, was led by her friends to the saint, who said to her gently, Be at peace, and wait. Some days after, this woman walked with Lydwine in the spirit, in a gorgeous palace, and it was there so saturated with the most exquisite perfumes, that, after her return to earth, even the most exquisite perfumes seemed nauseous to her. But her troubles had evaporated in the celestial waves of those perfumes, and when the evil spirit tried again to enter her, she met his assaults without a tremor. Another such case was that of a woman married to a cruel brute, whose incessant ill temper found vent in storms of blows. Patience, repeated Lydwine, when begged to pray that his violence should abate. But the weeks went by, and the wretched woman continued to be beaten at the last word. Tired of this existence, she resolved to hang herself, but some friends discovered this in time and prevented her. Then she thought of drowning herself in the Meuse, and took advantage of a moment when her husband was absent and her intimates were not watching, to run to the river. But on the way she reflected, Lydwine has always been so kind to me that I do not wish to die without bidding her good-bye. And she turned towards Lydwine's house. At this instant, Lydwine, surrounded by her nurses, exclaimed, Go quickly, and open the door to her who is knocking there, for her heart is breaking. And no sooner had the wretched woman entered the saint's room, that she sank on her knees and sobbed. Do not think any more of suicide, my dearest, said Lydwine, but go back home, for the tyrant who you fear is changed into the most loving of husbands. Relying on this promise, the woman, after having begged and received the sick woman's blessing, went home. Her husband was in bed and asleep. She undressed noiselessly so as not to disturb him, and also went to sleep. The next morning she found a smiling man, who no longer abused her or knocked her about. If it only lasts, thought she, but it did last. This violent fellow became, by a miracle, gentle and pleasing from that time forward.